hope you had a great networking session. And now I'd like to proceed to our next segment, which is a talk by Dr. Gautam Wankhede on the topic Lessons from COVID Strengthening the Molecular Diagnostic Industry of India. For this, I would like to welcome Dr. Wankhede. He is the Director of Medical Affairs at Mylab Discovery Solutions. He has over 15 years of experience in transfusion and laboratory medicine and has previously worked with the NHS in UK at Fortis Escorts Hospital, Biorad Laboratories as medical advisor and as scientific consultant at Diamed. He is a graduate from the Government Medical College Nagpur and has pursued postgraduate specialization in transfusion and transplantation at the University of Bristol, UK. Over the past years, Dr. Gautam has been involved in developing path-breaking and life-saving products for use in healthcare settings, for which he also has patents in his name. At Mylab Discovery Solutions, he and his team have been developing innovative molecular diagnostic solutions with an aim of democratizing gene-based medical diagnostics. Recently, Mylab became the first Indian firm to get full approval for making and selling coronavirus kits. Over to you, Dr. Wankhede.
Good evening, and thanks a lot for the invite. And first of all, I'd like to thank the team at HitLab for allowing us to present how the way we have contributed to the COVID fight and how, in general, the molecular diagnostics industry in India and across the globe is going to change post the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic, which has struck us. So there's a lot to learn. We've lost a lot, but we also probably gained a few things which will help us in the long term. And that's how humans have always evolved, trying to learn from the mistakes, trying to learn from the calamities, and we are going through one such calamity right now. So basically, before I get into how the industry, the molecular diagnostics industry, has completely transformed over the last 8 to 10 months, it'll be a good idea, I just thought, to just spend one slide, a couple of minutes, talking about what actually is molecular diagnostics. How is it different from the classical way of diagnosing any disease or any medical condition? So obviously, the most common way or the oldest way is to rely on symptoms, is to rely on the patient's clinical presentation of any disease. Obviously, the accuracy is going to be very low. A lot of it will be dependent on the physicians or the clinicians' knowledge. Or there are also some biochemical parameters. For example, you would simply do a sugar test. It might say that you have high sugar. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a full-blown diabetes. It could just be a case of bad food in the last couple of hours. That is the most basic way of doing diagnosing any disease. Then comes the immunodiagnostics. It's a way of finding out how a body responds to a disease. How do we produce antibodies, right? So if, say, someone is suffering from HIV or hepatitis, so we try to find out whether the patient's body has any antibodies against that particular disease or infection. That has been a cornerstone of diagnosing disease for the last 30 years, starting from, I would say, mid-70s up to until like 5 or 7 years back. That was considered as a very good way of diagnosing a disease. But a drawback of that was we were looking at the human body's response against a pathogen or a disease condition. We were not directly looking at the disease itself. And this is where molecular diagnostics completely changes the paradigm. Here, we're not looking at the symptoms. We are not looking at the response of the body. We are trying to identify the causative organism by looking at the specific genetic code, some gene sequences which are particular to that particular organism. Or if it's cancer, we might say that we're looking at a particular genetic mutation which causes cancer. So it becomes highly accurate, very, very precise. And the most important thing, especially when it comes to infectious diseases, is the early stage of diagnosis. The moment a person gets infection, within a day or within a couple of days of getting infected, a molecular diagnostic test is able to diagnose the presence of that particular infection. So getting into the Indian medical diagnostics industry. So it's one of the more stable industry over the last 10, 15 years. And with the increase in middle class, the increasing spend, the increasing awareness about lifestyle diseases, a lot of Indians are now getting tested regularly. It's growing steadily over the last 5 to 7 years. It's a big industry now. It's about $9 billion. It was valued at it about in just last year, and out of which about 60% came from the pathology segment of the diagnostics industry. But half of it, or a majority of it, was from routine tests like sugar test, thyroid, cholesterol test, something that a lot of people do themselves, or the doctors asked ask the patients to get tested as a first line diagnostics. Very limited of these tests are based on molecular or genomics based testing. That was still in the range of 5 to 7% of the entire pathology testing being done in India. Historically, especially in the last 5 to 7 years, the pathology business has become highly scalable. The reason for that being there are good 4 or 5 big labs in India. I won't take names right now, but these labs have come out with a very good hub and spoke model, wherein they have huge centralized reference testing labs, and they have a large number of smaller collection centers wherein the sample is collected, taken to the bigger center overnight by flight or if other modes of transport, and then the testing is done in those bigger centers. And out of the entire, 5 or 6 billion dollar industry, majority of it, in spite of the urban population of India just being 30-35%, the contribution in terms of the revenue is about 65% from the urban centers. So that's the background. A little bit more detail about these diagnostic industries. As I was telling you, the diagnostic chains, especially the bigger ones, have emerged as pan-India player. So one company may have a testing lab in Delhi or Bombay, but they have collection centers across the country. That's as I was telling you, that's because of good logistics now. And because of that, a major problem that was emerging over the last 5 to 7 years were the standalone centers. The standalone centers were not able to start a complex test. A complex test would be something like molecular diagnostics, because number one, it required high capital expenditure, it required specifically trained manpower, and obviously it also required a lot of information, a lot of training to be given to clinicians, or to the referring physicians to do that test. So over the last 5 to 7 years, there was a trend emerging that complex tests were only being carried out by these huge chains who followed the hub and spoke model. But the smaller standalone labs were doing more and more basic tests. In fact, the bigger diagnostic chains were actually acquiring the standalone centers and using them as collection centers to start sourcing the sample to the other to the reference labs. So that's how the Indian molecular diagnostic industry was pre-COVID. So what happened was, as far as the diagnostic testing of molecular test was concerned, TB was a major focus area because serology-based TB testing was completely done away with about 8 or 10 years back. So molecular diagnostics was, a lot of it was being used for TB. The other diagnostics, had not upgraded itself. So when it came to other diseases, they were still relying on classical immunodiagnostic method or biochemical methods, except for the really top tertiary centers in Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, and Hyderabad and all. But otherwise, it was mainly the classical method. It was mainly the top labs of India, the main major 5 or 6 centers who were doing molecular infectious diseases or molecular oncology tests that were being doing. There was no centralized database base of labs. We didn't know. In fact, I have a very good episode to tell over here. Way back in March, we had a meeting with the regulatory bodies of India. So all the manufacturers were called over there, and we had people from the Ministry of Health over there, and there was no database. No one knew how many PCR labs were there in the country. So when they were trying to find out that how many people can actually do COVID testing, everyone was at sea. People were just trying to you know uh, calculate or guesstimate the number of labs that could do the COVID testing. Because these labs were few and far between, there was very limited accreditation, and very limited standardization of the molecular tests. And I think one major part was that media hardly talked about molecular tests, right? Everyone was very keen about an Apple iPhone, from what was the difference between an Apple iPhone 8 and an Apple iPhone 9. But no one spoke about what is the difference between a molecular test, an RT-PCR based test, and a serological test. So that's how things were different. Majority of the molecular testing until a couple of years back, or maybe up until 1 year back, was life science, which was research labs, not diagnostic. And there was limited clinician or limited patient awareness about how important molecular diagnostics was. In fact, just a simple case study, even people were getting infected blood. All of us know it's a very famous thing that Mr. Amitabh Bachchan, he got blood transfusion long time back, and he got hepatitis through blood transfusion. Now there are very good molecular tests available to test donated blood for infections like hepatitis, for hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV. In fact, across the globe, these tests are mandatory, molecular tests, but in India they are still not mandatory. Such is the lack of motivation to move to a molecular testing based platform. But things changed during COVID. The world realized that the gold standard for testing COVID was RT-PCR. There was, unfortunately, India, in the early part of the pandemic, I'm talking about February, March, the years of lethargy shown by India to adopt model medical diagnostics like RT-PCR and other molecular tests was hurting us. There were hardly any labs available which were ready to do a gold standard test like RT-PCR test for the COVID-19 in February or March. The hub and spoke model, which was working wonderfully well for other tests like say HIV or other things, for the big large labs, couldn't quite succeed in COVID-19. One, because COVID-19 also required specialized sample collection. It was not just pure blood collection like we do for other tests. It required nasopharyngeal or oropharyngeal swabbing, which required trained manpower. The sample could not be easily transported from, say, X city to Bombay or Delhi over 12 or 24 hours, because it was highly contagious. We could not afford the leakage of a single vial of a sample of COVID-19 person. Plus, a quick turnaround time was required. We could not wait for 3 or 4 days for the result, because if we waited for 3 or 4 days, in that 3 or 4 day period, a suspect can transmit the disease to hundreds of others. So it was not, the hub and spoke model wasn't working. And as a country, we were totally reliant on imported kits for diagnosing COVID-19. I'm talking about February or March. If the government decided to follow the test, track, and treat strategy, it was a great strategy, but for that strategy to work, we require a robust molecular diagnostics infrastructure in the first place. But that's where probably the Indian spirit really came into being. To the credit, the government, the academic bodies, industry, the laboratory people, they really reacted very fast in a very, very systematic manner. Government really fastened up the clearance process for imported COVID-19 kits. In fact, Indian manufacturers, which normally, when as an Indian manufacturer, I can tell you with my experience, it takes years for a kit to be validated by a government body, and then for the regulatory body to give us the manufacturing license. In this case, we got it within weeks. So a credit to the government for that. In fact, Mylab Discovery had the distinction of being the first Indian manufacturer to receive the ICMR and the CDSO clearance. Our kits were evaluated with 100% accuracy and 100% sensitivity as well over there. So, and the accreditation bodies also adopted a very quick online auditing mode. Earlier, if a lab wanted to get itself audited, it had to apply, and then it could be about a month or even 40-45 days before an assessor flew down to the lab and then did an audit. Now, in a matter of a day or two, you can have an online audit and get an accreditation done, based on which ICMR would then give you the right or the clearance to carry out the COVID testing. Similarly, reporting and record keeping of all this became very robust. People have a database wherein they can enter all the results. So that's something which is wonderful. Uh, Another thing which, as I was talking about, is the database. Now, if you go to the ICMR website, you can exactly see on a daily basis. You can see a screenshot from 29th of November. You can see the total number of labs in India which are doing RT-PCR or other testing for COVID, and obviously the number of RT-PCR labs. Now, compare this to what happened in February, March, wherein government officials were completely at sea. No one knew how many RT-PCRs are there in India, which centers are carrying out RT-PCR tests. So there's a massive changes as far as the database is concerned. The guidelines about using different test kits are completely clear now. Which kits to use, which transport media to use, which extraction kits to use. And ICMR, the government is working very hard to come out with very good standardized guidelines. The local authorities are also working very hard. A lot of state governments, cities are ramping up the capacity to do RT-PCR tests. They're doing public-private partnerships to ensure that a lot of testing is carried out. And as far as the industry is concerned, so as I was telling you, because the environment in general was in favor of serological testing, there were very few molecular diagnostic manufacturers in India. And obviously, the only serious players like Mylab Discovery, there's also Mall Diagnostics, only the serious players became the first ones to get approval for COVID-19 molecular testing. Obviously, over the next 2 months, other manufacturers also joined it. Mylab also ramped up its production capacity. So the overall effect of all this has been the Indian companies have now started manufacturing a large number of kits with the main focus on COVID-19 and also many instruments. But it's given a fillip to a big boost to the diagnostics manufacturing industry in India too. Now coming to the very important part, the laboratories. Whatever ultimately all the rules and regulations, everything affects the laboratories because they are the ones who actually have to carry out the test. And this has been the most significant change in the last 8 months. From just one lab to carry out test for COVID-19 in January, we now have more than 2,100 labs which carry out COVID-19 tests. And also now what is happening is because there is a decline in the traditional testing. So very few people are getting admitted. Very few hospital procedures are happening, especially in the period from April, May, June, and July. So labs had to adopt. They had to come out with something new so as to sustain. So that's why a lot of labs decided to invest energy, invest resources and manpower in setting up molecular diagnostics or RT-PCR based tests. And that's how there's a whole change in the way laboratories are now looking at molecular diagnostics. So it's been a huge impact on the industry. Significant investment has come in the molecular lab infrastructure. There's a lot more awareness about diagnostics. In fact, I've seen journalists, I've seen whole news programs now dedicating hours to make the general public aware as to what is a real-time PCR test, what is a cartridge-based test, what is an antibody test, what is an antigen test. Earlier, no one spoke about it. The government agencies are also doing their bit by communicating a lot to people. They're educating people. They're asking people to get tested, right? There's a whole database, as I was telling you. And now this is also a very interesting slide. Look at the cities where you have the possibility of doing a molecular test now. Places like Barabanki, places like Hapur. Now, if 1 year back, someone told me that there is a molecular testing laboratory in rural India, I would be surprised. I would say maybe, one just came up, but it's not working. But because of COVID, even in rural areas, in tier 3 cities also, you have these laboratories up running and doing a wonderful job by carrying out regular molecular testing. So it's an unprecedented times. It's completely shaken down the system. But what has now happened is high quality molecular diagnostics has now been made affordable and also being made available to the masses. People are actually now demanding RT-PCR tests. A lot of my non-medical background, friends call me and they simply ask me that we want to get a RT-PCR test done. We don't want an antigen test. Now, 1 year back, no one even knew what is an RT-PCR test. They just knew that there's a test for a disease. No one knew that there's a difference between a molecular test and an antigen test or an antibody test. The prices have come down drastically. There are many entrepreneurs, who have started establishing small labs in smaller rural areas or semi-urban areas also. So the dependency, the hub and spoke model of the larger labs has also been, hit a little bit. So they are also doing great business, but a lot of smaller entrepreneurs have also come out with good labs. There's a completely new ecosystem of innovation has just, evolved over the last 8 to 9 months. With more than 2,000 molecular labs, the testing scope is also high. So obviously, over the next 3 or 4 months or 6 months, hopefully, with vaccine coming in, with people getting more and more awareness about COVID, and hopefully COVID going down, the testing of COVID may or may not be as high as it is being done today. But with the infrastructure of more than 2,000 molecular labs, the same instrument, the same manpower can then be used for testing other diseases, oncology, infectious diseases on the same molecular platform. Now that we have the infrastructure, I'm sure people will start doing a lot of tests on the molecular platform. And it's a global phenomenon. If you look at the global market, molecular diagnostics, without COVID, it's just about $9 billion. But COVID itself is contributing about $4.5 billion. So half of the entire molecular diagnostics business has now been taken over by COVID. That's how bigger jump across the globe we have seen, and it's obviously positively impacted the molecular diagnostics market. Um, a test which was a very developed world specific test, something which only happened in Western Europe or the Americas, is now happening in every part of the country. So it's a big, I would say, you know understanding. I mean, we have to understand it's a big achievement by India. We've really penetrated to every nook and corner of the country. In fact, many Asian manufacturers have now looked at the opportunity. So, apart from serving the Indian or the Asian markets, Asian manufacturers are now actually going and dominating in European and US markets as far as the molecular diagnostic kits are concerned. So, there's a complete shift in the way diagnostics has been approached over the last 30 40 years as compared to what's happened in the last 8 to 9 months. From an Indian perspective, with this, as and when the COVID pandemic comes to an end, with all the infrastructure in place, I'm sure the government will also have great opportunity to leverage that infrastructure to to fight other diseases. For example, government has a TB elimination plan by 2025, for which they plan to come out with 8,000 molecular labs over the next 5 to 6 years. Now, 8,000 labs in 5 years, you would have thought that's a typical, far-fetched government policy which will never come through. But if 2,100 labs can come up in 8 months, why can't 8,000 labs come up in the next 5 years? It's very doable. Something which was looking very difficult is definitely possible now. The Central Lux Control Organization, the CDSCO, has granted manufacturing license to more than 30 companies now. Obviously, these companies, or molecular diagnostic companies, which are manufacturing COVID-19 kits, will start developing and manufacturing other kits of molecular testing too. There's mobile RT-PCR testing labs which are come up. So some areas which are not easily accessible, some areas which do not have a molecular lab, a mobile lab can travel to that center and to that area and carry out RT-PCR based on mobile molecular testing over there. And with so many labs now having NABL accreditation, the standards, the whole policy around molecular testing has become very crystal clear now. So there was this halo of uncertainty. A year back or 2 years back, if someone wanted to start a molecular diagnostics lab, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how many rooms to make, what is a preparation room, what is a PCR room, what is a segregation room, and all these kind of things. But now there are very clear-cut guidelines, very good standardized ways of establishing labs. So, apart from the regular things, there are more sophisticated lab techniques apart from real-time PCR, like next generation sequencing, LAMP, CRISPR, which are being developed, on a regular basis. So universities, research institutions now see the possibility of the research being utilized for commercial and for public health, public welfare easily. And so that has completely changed the way people look at molecular diagnostics. So just to sum up, uh, what we say has been over the last 8 to 10 months, there has been a completely a generational shift in the medical diagnostics segment, something which should have happened in the last 8 to 10 years, but somehow it wasn't happening. But this unfortunate event or the pandemic in the last 1 year or so has completely made a generational shift. It's forced us to modernize in a way. And the applications, right now obviously are mainly limited to COVID-19. But there are other infections, there's oncology, there's predictive illness. All this can also be used by just, leveraging the infrastructure, which is already there now. So on the same infrastructure, using the same platform, all these tests can also be carried out. Things like blood safety, molecular tests for screening blood donors, which is such an important thing. It's done in every blood bank in every part of the world. India has still not adopted it. I think now, with the awareness, with the availability of the infrastructure, this can become a reality now for us. The whole ecosystem, it's not only the labs, the research, the manufacturing, the regulatory bodies, the testing, everything has changed and it's going to evolve over the next years. There's a whole, it's the ball is set into motion now, and it is only going to move faster and faster as we go on. And obviously, having learned this lesson, that when the pandemic hit India or the globe, and when it came to India in February or March, we only had one lab which was doing the COVID testing. So I think government, as well as private institutions, private hospitals or labs, will now understand that sometimes it's important to invest in newer technologies. Let's not wait for a pandemic to hit us and then adopt. Rather than that, why not be prepared for it, invest on it, and that's what happens in most of the good universities or labs in other parts of the world. Some tests may not have a clear application in the current scenario, but if we see an application coming in the future, the government and private institutions should have the infrastructure ready to adopt it. And as and when if required, we can start utilizing it to save lives, as we've learned with the COVID pandemic. So that's it as far as I'm concerned. All I'd like to say is to all of you to stay safe. And with a lot of positive things happening in the last 6 months with the vaccine around the corner, I hope things will get better. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Wankhede. Thank you so much for the wonderful session. We have a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure.
Number one is, how do you think India can improve access of diagnostic testing to rural and remote areas?
So obviously, a couple of things. So I spoke about the mobile van. The number two thing is the government will now understand the importance of having such tests, such advanced testing technology. So government obviously will have to then, force or come out with tenders and all to come out with a test even in the rural areas, come out with such labs in the rural areas. Finally, I think logistics. Sometimes every latest diagnostic test cannot go to a rural area. So we can have very good logistics so that a sample can be collected even in the remotest of area, brought to a comparatively, modern part of the vicinity where the test is available. So a couple of things. And obviously the private centers will also now go to the rural areas.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I think we can take one more question. Uh, that is, learning from COVID, how do you think can government and players of diagnostic industry collaborate for better preparedness of such crisis?
So I think they've already started collaborating. I think there are some state governments which have now started reaching out to private labs, and they've given a certain number of tests that a private lab has to do. So you cannot work in complete isolation. The government and the private labs have to work together. The workload has to be split. If because with a country like India, if you talk about the number of patients going to a government hospital will obviously be high because the cost of healthcare is much cheaper over there, or it's free over there. but a government lab will be completely under a lot of burden to do that. So it's important for the burden to be shared, some profits to be shared by the private labs also, and that's the only way for the country of our size we can handle a pandemic like this or any other one. It has to be public-private partnerships wherein the private labs and the government labs come together and share the burden of testing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the wonderful session, and thank you for answering the questions. It was great to have you. And I would like to now move on to our next session.